Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar from the Canadian Yearbook of International Law, focusing on the international economic system in a flux in search of a way forward. My name is Jen Malat from Cambridge University Press, and before we get started, I'd like to go over a few quick housekeeping items. You have all joined in listen-only mode. Please submit any questions via the Q&A box, and the panelists will review them if there is time. In the unlikely event we experience any major technical issues, we will restart the webinar. The whole event will take about 90 minutes. To get things started, I will turn everything over to Kristen Boone, the editor-in-chief of the Yearbook, who will introduce the panelists.
Fabulous. Thank you very much. Good morning, everyone. I'm Kristen. I'm the editor-in-chief of the Canadian Yearbook of International Law and also the dean of the Common Law section at the University of Ottawa. Merci à toutes et à tous d'avoir été des nôtres pour ce premier webinaire organisé par l'Annuaire canadien de droit international. Nous espérons que cela vous offrira des perspectives stimulantes et éclairantes. It's a real pleasure to open this very first webinar hosted by the Canadian Yearbook of International Law. We're especially proud to launch this initiative because academic inquiry with global legal and policy issues are really at the heart of what we do. And today's topic couldn't be more timely. From trade tensions to technological transformation and climate finance, the international economic landscape is shifting, and so too are the institutions and frameworks meant to support it. Multilateralism is under pressure, but also evolving, and this panel brings together exceptional voices to help us understand how and why. Let me begin by giving a big thank you to Professor B.C. Akingubi, who has brought together this panel and will be the moderator today. I extend my sincere thanks to him for launching this first initiative. I'd also like to thank our distinguished panelists for being with us. Your insights, rooted in both academic thought and real-world experience, will help us frame the challenges and possibilities ahead. I'd like to thank the editorial team of the Canadian Yearbook of International Law, along with Cambridge University Press, for putting this together. And finally, thank you to all of you in the audience for joining us. Ce webinaire marque le début d'une série de dialogues que nous espérons nourrissants pour la recherche, l'enseignement et la pratique du droit. So, BC, I will hand it over to you. I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you very much, Dean Boone. And like you have just said, you are all welcome to joining us on this first Canadian Yearbook of International Law webinar. I am a member of the board of the Canadian Yearbook of International Law, but also a professor at the Schulich School of Law and a visiting professor at the University of Ottawa's Common Law section. In both capacities, I have convened this workshop. Thanks also to Dr. Alan Gay Sipowo, who is in charge of the CYBIL webinars for the collaboration, and an honor to have convened this panel of experts to discuss the troubling state of international economic law today. My task here as a moderator is one to move the conversations along swiftly so that we can get to our panelists' thoughts. Just a word in terms of the order for our attendees. Each of the panelists will have about 6 minutes where they'll give their opening remarks. Once that round is done, we'll go to 2 quick fire sections where they will then have the opportunity to reflect further on questions that they have in relation to this subject matter. Okay, without much ado, we'll kick off now with Professor Kathleen Clausen, who has joined us from Georgetown Law.
Great. Thank you so much, BC. Thanks to you, to Kristen, and to the Yearbook and Cambridge University Press for the generous invitation to be a part of this important conversation and to come to you from Washington with a view on the important question as to, I think, what's going on was one of the original prompts that you gave us, and then, of course, what to make of all that's happening. So in my opening 6 minutes, I'd like to touch on 3 points. They are all of these 3 points. I'm only going to tell a sort of partial story, in part because 6 minutes is not a lot of time, but also because I think we have a knowledgeable audience here, and also there's so much more that could be said, obviously, on all these points that I look forward to reading about in the yearbook in the coming months. So 3 points. The first is how is this happening? And I'll come back to this in a minute and what I have in mind. The second is what does it reflect? That I think is the more difficult of all. And then thirdly, whether this is a moment for innovation, perhaps surprisingly. So those 3 points here. So starting with how is this happening? What I want to emphasize here is how the structure of U.S. law has, over the last 100 years, and that's pretty much the right timeline, has supported free trade, but has left space for what some would consider to be a rather dangerous gateway. Let's put it that way. So, but what I mean by that is, over the last 100 years, the U.S. Congress, which has the prerogative in the U.S. legal system to direct foreign commerce, it has created and emphasized a way through which the executive can promote our free trade institutions, right? The WTO, all the agreements leading to the WTO, free trade agreements. That has been the point of emphasis for so many of our trade laws over the last century. But at the same time, in all of those laws, there have also been, let's call them exceptions, or we'll call them caveats, or there have been alternative routes that have been left in place for the executive branch to take. And now we found ourselves in the last decade with an executive that wants to take those routes. Now, again, I think we can have a longer conversation, and there are more experts out there than I about why this shift has happened, whether we call it a backlash, whether it's a response to something. I'm going to leave that to one side. But the point I wanted to make, again, for those who may not be aware, is that for 100 years, although our primary policy as a nation has been toward free trade for the most part, there have been all these exceptions built in. And what makes them particularly maybe attractive or dangerous, again, depending how you look at it, is that the rationale through which you access those exceptions is national security. So all of these laws that allow the president to do what he's doing now, to put tariffs on products, to raise tariffs on products, to close markets, essentially, those laws are premised on a national security rationale. All he does is he invokes some sort of national security, some burden on the U.S. economy, and that gives him access to these authorities. So that's an important distinction, that I think a bifurcation really in our law that has been undernoticed until the first Trump term, where we sort of experimented, and then we got to, of course, where we are of the last two months. Second point, what does this reflect? So I said this is a big question that I'm not going to tackle in full, but the only thing I would say is that I think it does reflect something that we haven't talked enough about, which is sort of the mixed success of international regulatory cooperation. We don't, as international economic law scholars and practitioners, always think so much about international regulatory cooperation. And I think that does a disservice to how the two fields interact. International regulatory cooperation is the bread and butter, to many respects, of international economic law. Right? Our regulators are today, in this globalized world, working together all the time on various issues which come up in small ways, maybe at the TBT committee or the SPS committee at the WTO, but which are really, again, the backbone of the global economy. And so if you listen to the rhetoric of the White House and the Trump administration officials on what are they most concerned about, why do they think security is at risk, why are they dissatisfied with other countries' practices, a lot of that is non-tariff barriers, right? They will also talk about tariffs, surely. But I think, again, we're not spending enough time thinking about where the world is on non-tariff barriers to trade, and how we should conceptualize that together, again, with this idea of international regulatory cooperation. Third and final point is whether this could be a moment for innovation. I think we're all relatively depressed. Many international economic law scholars who see maybe the system at risk, who have been teaching in this space for a long time, writing in this space for a long time, and have concerns. But I do think that there are opportunities here that we should not underestimate. One is to say that now the obviously discussion here in DC is about deals, what kind of deals are going to be made. And so there's plenty of space here, I think, to talk about what deals could and should look like from an international law perspective, let alone to get to their content. So many of you know I spent a lot of time thinking about alternatives to free trade agreements, and I think this is a moment where we can capitalize on some of that energy in a way that might be positive for many delegations. And lastly, whether this is a moment in innovation for thinking about trade tools more generally, beyond deals. I hesitate to say this, but I do think this is in a way just the beginning of thinking about how, at least in US law, some of these delegations to the president can be exercised. We're thinking right now strictly mostly about tariffs, but they leave a lot of space for other sorts of tools and collaborations as well. So that's my final point, BC, is that we might see some space for innovation here. This is happening because of the U.S. bifurcation. It reflects a broader discussion on non-tariff barriers and international regulatory cooperation, and again, some hopefulness maybe for some positive things that may come out of this. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Kathleen, for setting us up very well. On that last note, many people may take a deep breath, and say, whether the hope is there for innovation, but your point is well taken. We'll move on swiftly to Lauren Bartels now, who's joined us from the University of Cambridge. Maybe location may be different, but thank you very much, Lauren, for joining this panel.
Thanks, Bessie, and thanks to the Canadian Yearbook of International Law. I'm hoping to learn from today's discussion, and I'm sure I will. I already have, from what Kathleen has been saying. My job, which is maybe a bit odd, given that I'm an Australian, is to talk about how the world looks, the international economic order looks from the perspective of Europe and the UK. And of course, those two things might or might not be the same, depending on your perspective. I think the starting point for me is probably not deals. From that side of the world, everybody, as probably everywhere else in the world, is still in shock at the great disruption that we are now seeing. One has to credit the French with some foresight for having invented and then pushed onto the EU, which has run with this, the concept of strategic autonomy. Now that, of course, is a little bit code for protectionism, but it does also reflect that the world is changing. We are no longer in a simple or simplistic world order where the market reigns, the rules guarantee a free market. It's not perfect, but essentially the trade regime is a system of competition law applied to what ideally at some point might turn into a sort of larger version of the EU. I mean, that was, I think, the vision of the WTO. You'll remember, lots of people on this call will remember or know about ideas of constitutionalization that emerged at the beginning of the WTO's tenure. Well, nobody's talking about constitutions anymore. I think we are now, at best, if we're talking about agreements, talking about peace agreements, maybe not even peace agreements, maybe truces. But to come back to my first point, it's not so much deals from my perspective. It is disruption and reactions to that disruption. Now, there is one interesting, let's say, self-propagating, self-perpetuating point, a sort of vicious circle, which I think we can see now, which comes out of the United States, which is the blending. And this also goes back to one of the points Kathleen mentioned, the blending of, well, protectionism with economic security. And that can be done in the hard, legally relevant form of national security, or it can be done in a slightly softer way, or one can blur the bounds of national security to include economic security, which is certainly happening domestically in the United States. At the WTO, to the extent that this has been discussed, it's still a bit of a mixed bag. But it's different parts of the security exception more or less flexible. So it's I think still a little bit up for grabs how far that can go. But from a political point of view, I think there is no doubt now that some degree of security from an economic point of view is just the way that everybody is thinking about the world. Now, what does this actually mean for the EU and the UK? Well, they are scrambling, obviously, to make a decision about how much they can trust the US now. I mean, that is a big decision. Again, deals or no deals. I'm not seeing the mood music from there as being very conducive to deals other than the EU's regular ask of 0 for 0 tariffs on industrial products, which of course I mean, it's sort of a meme, right? It doesn't work for the US, but it does work for the EU for obvious reasons. I mean, exactly why Trump's going on the way he is because he doesn't want more 0 for 0 when there is a trade deficit in goods with the EU. But aside from that, I'm not seeing a great deal of appetite. Instead, I think it's now the same question that's being asked. And first, I'm going to talk about the EU a little bit. The question is being asked of the US, as the question has been asked in recent years of China, which is de-risking, right? How much do we need to depend on an unreliable trade partner, whether that, or trade partner in the US case, security partner in the US case, and of course, security rival in the case of China. So strategic autonomy, proper strategic autonomy now requires, in a 19th century great game kind of way, trying to work out who the allies are. And I think that is a big picture question. I can't answer that question, but based on what the EU has done historically, and now I imagine that the future will look something like trying to find the right allies. And I'm pleased to say, I think, given the forum that we're in, that Canada would be right up there in the EU's list of allies. Canada's situation is, of course, also obviously complicated right now, but Canada has historically formed a close alliance with the EU when it comes to upholding what is left of the multilateral trade order. And there are other countries too. Let's see how they go. And my final point then is going to be on the UK. So the UK is in a difficult position, as Canada is in a difficult position, as indeed the EU and as Australia. I mean, we are all in difficult positions because we all depend on different countries who are not themselves friends. I mean, in a sense, we're all like children of divorcing parents. It's not particularly easy. But from the UK's point of view, it's trying to have it both ways. That's, of course, a well-established theme in UK diplomacy. On the one hand, it wants to do something to undo the economic damage of Brexit by being closer to the EU right now. Hidden and some regulations under, I think it's the Weights and Measurements Act or something like that, is essentially dynamic alignment with EU regulatory standards, which is done in a not very transparent or democratic way, but it's, a way of becoming closer to the EU. There's talk of free movement for youth, and although it's not called that, obviously, because it would upset or perceived to upset people. On the other hand, the UK still sees itself as having a close relationship with the United States, and so it wants it every which way. Now, one can see that in the reaction to the current situation. The EU has been very strong, talks of coercion and anti-coercion. The UK doesn't do any of that. The UK doesn't talk about retaliating. The UK breaks away and tries to cut a good deal. And now the fact that the UK got 10%, whereas the EU was stuck with 20% until 2 days ago, was held up even by Labour MPs in Parliament as being a Brexit benefit. That just gives you a sense of the state of debate in the UK. So let me finish now. I think I've probably gone on to my 6 minutes. I think the items to watch right now are how the EU, from my perspective, and the UK choose to play this new great game. How will they move the pieces on the chessboard? Where will we end up? Well, I don't know, but hopefully by the end of this hour, we will all know. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Laurent. Well, the promise of whether we'll know by the end of the hour is a very interesting one. But also note you've not, carefully not mentioned friendshoring at all, or any of those ideas that came up in terms of how collaborations have been happening outside of the traditional context. But I'll move on now to our next panelist, John W. Bosqueril. John, to say a word about him or two, is the head of McCarthy Tetrault, firm's international trade and investment law group, and a partner in their litigation group. John, we're glad that you're able to join us on this conversation today. Intentionally, if I may say, the conversation for the benefit of our attendees is meant to have a fusion of practitioners and scholars, and therefore we hope this brings the ideas we really want to discuss today. John, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Beasy, and thank you to the CYIL as well as the Ottawa Common Law section for pulling this together and supporting this event. Out of all the panelists today, I'm going to be learning the most, I think. I think it's critically important to, as you say, Beasy, merge or meld the practitioner and scholarly views on these issues in terms of what's happening. I want to take my 6 minutes to talk about two things I see going on here, at least from our point of view here in Canada. First is the rise in the use of economic warfare measures. That term 2-3 years ago would be over the top, probably alarmist. I don't think it is anymore today. And secondly, the erosion, or some would say the disappearance of the rule of law in international economic relations, or for us, international trade law. Perhaps those go hand in hand necessarily. But regardless, I think from the perspective of practitioners in the business community, both are happening right now. And to give you a bit of perspective, when I started, and I'm going to date myself now, but I started as a practicing lawyer in 1995. We had just negotiated NAFTA. We brought Mexico into the free trade relationship between Canada and the United States. We had just negotiated and finalized the agreements of the World Trade Organization. It was a very promising and exciting time for a trade lawyer. And much of our practice was combing through these agreements. It also included investment dispute mechanisms and so forth, and that was a big part of it as well. But combing through these agreements and advising companies and governments on the application of those measures on the application of those agreements to government measures. And there was this idea at the time that these were binding agreements. We had exceptions. Softwood lumber for us in Canada was a huge one, where there were trade disputes that were not finalized or resolved in a satisfactory way under these agreements. But those were minor exceptions. For the most part, the idea was countries would comply with their obligations under these agreements, and the business community was relying on that. And at that time, one of the hot issues was Helms-Burton and the extraterritorial application of U.S. sanctions against Cuba under the Cuban Asset Control Regulations. And a lot of us did a lot of analysis around that, whether that could be something that would fit within the exception for the protection of essential security interests that's built into the WTO agreements. It was in NAFTA. It's in most trade agreements now. And a lot was written on the self-judging elements of that exception. But again, these were things at the margin. These were smaller measures in the big picture, especially a country like Canada that relied so much on exports and access to export markets. The expectation was we would comply with the measures. Today, that feels no longer to be the case, even from Canada's perspective. And again, 2-3 years ago, I think this would be unheard of, but in the fall, before the second Trump administration, Canada imposed 100% duties against Chinese electric vehicles. We imposed 25% duties against Chinese aluminum and steel products. The Canadian government launched consultations in the fall on applying measures intended to maintain and promote Canada's economic security interests. And that was a very critical, I think, a very critical consultation, and sent a very important signal from Canada that um, we were going to be examining all of our trade measures, including customs and tariffs, anti-dumping measures, countervailing measures, foreign investment review, economic sanctions, export controls, even supply chain measures. And we're now looking at it at this in this new lens of protecting economic security interests. Now, I imagine they would also say that equates with national security interests, but 5, 10 years ago, when we were looking at national security interests, we tried to argue very strongly, particularly Canada would take that position as well, that something for your economic security interests was not typically something for national, that would fit within that scope of national security interest. We're in a very different place today. If you take a look at the Trump measures with respect to tariffs, Trump lashed out first at Canada and Mexico, the US's very closest trading partners, obviously sending a signal to the rest of the world as to what was to come, and justified those tariff measures against these two countries on the basis of IEEPA, the International Economic Emergency Powers Act, which is a piece of sanctions legislation. I mean, you could go back in history, and in the 70s, I understand President Nixon, for a very short period, had applied a 10% duty across the board. I think it was under the Trading with the Enemy Act at the time. But generally speaking, it was an important signal to all of us in the practitioner community that the Trump administration was using sanctions legislation, so legislation that would be used against Iran and others on the so-called axis of evil, to impose tariffs against its closest trading partner, that being Canada. So I think the other element of that certainly is, well, since we've seen at that time, now the reciprocal tariffs being implemented, at least at the 10% level by the Trump administration, on the same basis of some kind of national emergency under IEEPA. We're also seeing this new phenomenon of secondary tariffs against Venezuela. So this idea that if your country is going to be doing business with Venezuela, or I should say, if companies in your country are going to do business with Venezuela, your country can now be subject to tariffs. So taking a concept that was really developed under sanctions and applying it now to this tariff policy. The other element of that is, from the Canadian perspective, and this did not get much media attention in Canada, but we're now seeing the possibility of diversionary tariffs being implemented. And what I mean by that is tariffs that deal with the diversion of trade as a result of these Trump tariffs being implemented. So a couple of weeks ago, Canada announced consultations on diversionary tariffs for steel, essentially saying that once this tariff wall goes up in the United States, countries, including our friendly trading partners, will be looking for other markets. And Canada is concerned that they need to protect their steel industry, and steel won't be the only commodity that will have those tariffs for. So now we're even in a position here in Canada of, and I think it's going to happen elsewhere, of possibly imposing a tariff wall against some of our most friendly trading partners as an indirect result of what we've seen going on in the United States. So all of that to say, I think that's my 6 minutes up. But I think from the business community perspective, from the practitioner perspective, this idea of there being some remedy, some confidence or trust in international trade agreements is rapidly evaporating in this environment. And we're now back to traditional customs practices, what used to be considered kind of the boring bread and butter of dealing with all the issues on goods crossing the border and the calculation of what at the time were pretty small tariffs, if any tariffs, are now at the forefront. We're now focusing on how you figure out the origin of a product. What's the tariff classification of the product? How do you value that product when it crosses the border? Because all of that is driving the amount of tariff you have to pay and ultimately your access to that export market.
Thank you very much, John, for sharing those thoughts with us. You know, as you spoke, my mind went back to Kathleen's initial point on how you know, issues of non-tariff barriers has not actually, you know, been up the rank in the conversations. You've mentioned rules of origin as well, and some of those more you know, classic trade issues that you know we've been reminded of today may be the practice for some time. But I'll not take the temptation to spend any more time. I'd like to move on to our next speaker, and I'll just say a word or two about Gabrielle Massieu. If I may, Gabrielle say this: she recently retired after several years of great service at the WTO, where she retired as Senior Counselor Research Division. She's currently a visiting professor at the Common Law section of the Faculty of Law, University of Ottawa. Gabrielle, thank you very much for your many years of service to the international economic law community, and thank you for joining us on this panel.
Merci infiniment, professeur Bizi. Merci aux organisateurs de cette conférence, la doyenne Boone, et évidemment le journal qui prône cette conférence. I'm the last one. It's nice and difficult. I'd like to speak about things that some of you have touched upon, the importance of history, and in particular, the role of the WTO, which I believe remains fundamental as a forum for discussions, because this is what we need, but also that this is the occasion for innovation, the concept of economic security, and an old sentence of Bob Udek, that sometimes you need to break the law to move forward. So on the role of the power and importance of history, this was already said. And it's funny because in the recent year, my young colleagues at university were of the view that we should not teach about tariff. This is outdated and each country must have very, very low tariff. I always have the first class on tariff because this is the backbone, trying to regulate what appeared to be the most explicit and how it works. And today, with the request for reciprocal negotiations and the difference, we see how it's important. But WTO, although it's not because I'm an idealistic, WTO in the last 2-3 years has become a forum where we talk a lot about, for instance, climate, even water, digital, and now supply chain. Big report is coming. So I do believe that more than ever, there's a need for countries to talk and reflect. And if it's not WTO, it would have to be somewhere else. But this brings me to my third point, which was already raised at the end by Kathleen: innovation. What is necessary, I'm convinced, is to look at things a bit differently and maybe explore, because we are in a transition, second or third best. So again, reciprocal tariff. What are the pros and cons? Because you know very well that tariff negotiation is not traditionally cars for cars, but it may be car for tables if the importing country wants to protect its stable industry. This is where it will put all its eggs. But also those new mini deals or imperfect deals that exist, for instance, in critical mineral, in the context of supply chain. It's fundamental that the pandemic forced us to realize the role of supply chain. We never talked about that a few years back. So we need to talk about that in the context of the current situation, and where to do so at the moment. Only the WTO sort of talks more and more about that. In the WTO, in the context of the WTO, the current situation has triggered recently this declaration by Japan, Korea, and China. You see, it's awkward and healthy, because to me, it doesn't mean that the rule of law is dead, but it may mean that past agreements are not responding to the needs, at least of the United States, and whether we like it or not, it is a power. The issue is to reinstore a new sort of balance and maintain discussions. And in the context of restoring a balance, you all talked about economic security, and you know that in the last 2-3 years, some WTO reports, dispute reports, concluded that there's no economic security concept. But funny enough, a few weeks, maybe months after, the EU, the Commission created a department, a section called economic security. So things evolve. I'm not new in saying that. Things evolve. It's true that in evolving, it may hurt a lot people, some individuals, some countries. But as Judek said, all important change in history came after you break apart certain things. So I would just conclude at the moment in saying that the role of the WTO is as a form of governance, not anymore the super dispute settlement court. It may have been an outstanding miracle, but we destroyed it. Now the forum is still there. We need to talk. We need to keep talking. And this is what WTO can offer. And this is where academic, University of Ottawa and others need to be more present than ever, because innovation is a must. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Gabrielle, for those thoughtful interventions and invoking, Hudek, reminding us of some of these core ideas, especially around the governance role of the WTO. If you stick with us for a second, Gabrielle, you'll be the first person I'll ask the next question to. But I'd like to say to the audience who are attending that the Q&A function is there. If you have a question, you can just put it in there. We'll start responding to those either after this round of quick fire questions or shortly thereafter. And so, Gabrielle, you ended on the question of the role of the WTO. Many may just doubt, whether that role of governance is still there, even though, as you say, it may be hurtful. Rule of law may not be what we know it to be today, but you are right. China has, initiated a consultation process at the WTO. Canada has done her own. So it's not like all is dead, actually. So the question for you is, in terms of multilateralism, does it make sense, given the context that you all have set up today? Is regionalism, for example, the way to go? Regional action and protection, might those be areas where we should be thinking seriously about the future?
Thank you. I think we have to use all routes at the same time. And when I say consultation, I'm not thinking dispute, because I don't think it's the time for dispute, although I do think it is good for countries like Canada and others to recall that there's a rule and initiate dispute. But because the dispute settlement system is itself a bit handicapped, when I talk about governance, I'm talking more about discussions, informal discussions. When I talk about what some have called mini deals, I talk about imperfect subgroups. So in WTO, for instance, already in 2017, some countries, for instance, wanted to talk about digital or investment. Others didn't want. What did they do? The group who wanted to go ahead, they said, the hell, we go ahead. We don't have a formal committee. Well, we'll talk in the cafeteria. I'm talking about exchange of ideas to explore solutions. And maybe the perfect WTO, the perfect dispute settlement system is not there anymore. We cannot pretend it is. But it doesn't mean that the need for discussions on governance is gone. On the contrary, more. And this is at least the way I understood, and I support Kathleen's point on innovation in the process, the way we talk, subgroups. I'm a great believer in plurilateral that could expand. So we could have long-term goals that is a perfect non-discrimination sort of world club and all this. But in the meantime, we have to go for second best, third best, fourth best, but at least we keep talking and we keep exploring for the benefit of all, and we readjust. But my main sort of, without arrogance, suggestion is that we have to do things on all fronts: bilateral, national, plurilateral, WTO, and all at the same time to try to move the boat forward in this tsunami of changes. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Gabrielle. So I think it provides a good segue to go back to John, because one can think at a very basic level, this might mean, oh, law firms have more work to do somehow, or maybe not, right? We're not sure. But the question here is, how are businesses, right, impacted by this recasting, if you like, of protectionist economic measures, right, such as national economic securities or national security claims? How are these impacting the work you're doing, as you reminded us in Canadian context, economic warfare some years ago being on the table? You might take this in any way you want in terms of tariffs, sanctions, export and tech transfer controls, but the underlying key question is, how is it impacting the work that you do?
Yeah, thank you for that, Professor BC. In many ways, when governments fail to resolve these issues between them, the problem falls into the laps of the business community, the traders. And we have a failure here. We have a failure of governments to deal with these issues in a way that will allow for the free flow of goods and services and so forth. That's kind of the big picture here. And I don't want to say that we're blaming the WTO or any other trade regimes. I mean, they're only as strong as their members. And certainly if their members decide they're going to ignore those rules, the consequence is that things fall apart, that the rule of law now deteriorates as a result. So from the point of view of the business community, I'd say they feel there's been this major failure. Obviously, I don't want to put blame in one place or another, but obviously people would point towards the Trump administration, although I think, as I was saying earlier, there were signs even before at least before the second Trump administration, that we were already moving in that direction. And even for Canada, the so-called Boy Scout of the world, when it comes to abiding by trade obligations, we seem to readily be able to throw a lot of that aside and start imposing tariffs against China, which on their face seem to possibly be justified by economic security, but that isn't what traditionally we had in mind in terms of that national security exception that are in trade agreements. This has meant a lot more work for law firms. That obviously doesn't mean that's good for our business community, though. I'll be the first one to admit that. And as I said before, the focus is now very much back to the old traditional area of customs, which is had you asked me this 5 years ago, I'd be shocked we'd be in this position that we are now. I do recall in the 90s and early 2000s focusing much of that practice on the kind of bread and butter day-to-day issues of how do we classify a product? How do we figure out that product's origin? How do we value it? Those three kind of components of what goes into a declaration now at the border are now the difference, can make the difference between accessing the market and not accessing the market. And so that is now a big area of what we're advising businesses on. That's driving a lot of the work right now for law firms, and obviously keeping on top of all the developments. I would add one thing to this. I've been largely talking about tariffs, and that's been the focus up to now. But non-tariff retaliation is very much on the table here as well. So in Canada, for example, the provincial government in Ontario on Friday came out with a policy where they will not be sourcing, in many instances, from US suppliers. So it's a blatant discriminatory policy against US suppliers on government procurement. We can expect that is going to be reflected in the policies of other provinces and possibly in the federal government shortly here in Canada. We have also had, at least for a couple of days, the provincial government here in Ontario toy with the idea of export restrictions. So again, another non-tariff barrier where we've said we're going to tariff ourselves, although it's a tax on the export of electricity to the United States. And there's been talk here of going farther than taxes and instead imposing actual quantitative controls on certain products like nickel, like oil and gas, and like electricity going to the United States. So the retaliation has, although for the most part, has been in the form of surtaxes or counter tariffs. We are now looking at non-tariff measures as a form of retaliation here. And that's also an area that's triggering a lot more work on the law firm side.
Thank you very much, John, for those responses. I'll come back to you now, Lauren. For the benefit of gradually introducing our speakers as I've gone around and read their bio. It's been about talking about some of their work along the way. In addition to being a professor at Cambridge, is a counselor at the London offices of Freshfields. The question that comes to you is really how are countries reacting to Trump tariffs? You have the, as we've said, whether it's the UK specifically or the EU more generally, to think about here. Do you think, the EU's anti-coercion instrument or, WTO litigation, even though we've acknowledged it's not at its peak any longer, are ways in which the EU or at least other countries might be reacting to these tariffs, which John has given us a business side response to that.
Yeah, thanks. So, I mean, right now that's the talk, right? There's a war, a trade war going on, and the trade war has been launched by the United States, largely against China, but also against the rest of the world very dramatically. And countries are having to react to this, and they are doing it in a variety of ways. So, number one is they come to Washington as supplicants with offerings to hopefully assuage the anger of an angry God in Washington. Now, whether that's happening quite as much as the angry God likes to say that it is happening, I don't know, because I'm not in that room. But it's clearly happening a bit if reporting is to be believed, and some of it is quite extraordinary. Like the UK, for instance, comes and offers to water down its Online Safety Act, or maybe even tweak or even get rid of its digital services tax, which isn't such a big deal because it makes very little money out of that anyway, and it sounds good. There are other deals that other countries are making as well. So that's one option, right? You just essentially hope for the best, let's say. Another reaction, which is the reaction of China and the EU and Canada, is to retaliate. And it's very interesting what John says about the Canadian approach to this. The EU, of course, does have this famous anti-coercion instrument. I'll say a word about that. It also has an enforcement regulation, which is a bit limited in what it can respond to. It's basically, you have to call what the US is doing safeguards, and then you can do a counter safeguard. Somewhat legally fragile, although my friends in the Commission say that it's not legally fragile at all. But in any event, the EU's anti-coercion instrument is a big one, and that involves suspending government procurement. I think we can expect to see that if the instrument gets activated, because that's the least harmful thing, provided there's an alternative source. That's always very important. But, you know, whether consultancies with big contracts to service EU member state governments will continue to have those contracts is that's the big question for them. The other thing that the EU has said it's going to do is go after tech. What does that mean? It means that if a US company has a subsidiary in, say, Ireland, where a lot of the tech companies, US tech companies, have EU establishments, and the reason for those establishments, and this is in the EU's mind, is because of services commitments made in GATS. That means it can all be rolled back, and so the services commitments can be lifted, and for those sectors, and then the protections are gone, and they can be discriminated against, most obviously by taxing what they do. And this is what has been broadcast. It's not a secret. This is what they're thinking of doing. Now, that's a really big deal. It's also an interesting question under EU law, because on the one hand, an Irish company that happens to have US owners is US, certainly is under GATS, right? And it is under the anti-coercion instrument. That's the thinking there. But it's also an EU company. And so there is a very interesting question about whether the anti-coercion instrument is in fact okay under EU law in that respect. And by the way, it's an interesting contrast, let's say, with the EU's approach to investment law, where it says we don't need BITs because all your investments are protected under EU law. Well, it turns out they aren't if you're subject to the anti-coercion instrument. So that bit of legal thinking will need to be sorted out. So that's how it looks from the EU side. Of course, there are also WTO actions. The EU hasn't been so brave as to bring an action itself. It has joined consultations with Canada, which has brought several actions, and China has brought, I think it's now 5 or so in the WTO. We can't really expect that the US will pay much attention to that, but I think it's an important signal that the WTO dispute settlement system should still matter. Anyway, I'll just conclude by saying these are the measures of war, right? These are retaliations. Now, of course, as Clausewitz said, war is the continuation of politics by other means. And I'm sure that there are talks of truces. But, when you're dealing with the current US administration, one has to wonder what these talks are going to look like. Will they, when we're being innovative and creative, will they involve simply ditching your digital services tax, which is what they want? Will it mean ditching your domestic tax, VAT, which is what they want? Will it mean giving them Greenland? I don't know. I'm not from Greenland. Everything's up for grabs, right? So I don't know how much creativity and innovation is possible with the current US administration. But of course, just like we're seeing with Ukraine, at some point, there will have to be an agreement, and then we can start to talk, I think, of proper deals. But we haven't reached that point in Ukraine, and I wonder how long it's going to take before we can reach that point with the United States.
Interesting. Thank you very much, Laura. And it's interesting again, you just sort of giving me a good segue to continue with Kathleen, because you've mentioned deals, and I think we can have a conversation around what type of deals are we talking about. But I think one which she and Gabrielle have highlighted is the notion of mini deals, trade mini deals, which Kathleen has written about for the benefit of our attendees who might wish to see her work in, I think, Michigan Journal of International Law is where that is. But to come to you with a question, what can we expect, right? Do we expect deals of any sort? Is innovation a thing? It looks like there's some kind of even division on the possibility or impossibility of that, Kathleen. What are we seeing from other constituencies, especially in the United States, in response to this shift? And just before you start, Kathleen, I'd just like to give a heads up to the panelists. We have a good amount of questions now. So if you would like to look at them and prepare to respond, we will just move to that instead of going to the third round of questions in view of the time that we have. Okay, Kathleen, over to you.
Great, thanks. So what have been the reactions of constituencies, and let's think about that a little bit in terms of deals. The constituencies that I would put out, we've heard a lot from John about the business community, certainly in Canada, and I think the media covers well the business reaction in the U.S. So let me focus on particularly more the Congress and their role in deals, as well as maybe other parts of the U.S. government. So the different questions that Lauren just highlighted and BCU and Gabrielle a moment before. How much innovation is possible? How long will it take? And we'll have to sort of footnote here the trust issue that obviously any deal would pose given what we've seen. But let's come back to the role of Congress in this for a moment, because again, I mentioned briefly that it should be Congress that is in the driver's seat with respect to our trade policy according to our Constitution. And historically, Congress is the one that, of course, approves our free trade agreements and implements them into U.S. law. Now, there have been a number of deals that have not been approved by Congress, especially in recent years. And so one expects that might be the path that this administration seeks to pursue again. But there's no question that the Congress in this moment is particularly attuned to what the White House is doing on trade, which I couldn't have said 10 years ago on these mini deals. Many of them just sort of went under the radar, and Congress was not aware that they were happening or not overly concerned, certainly as a group. Now Congress is concerned, and that's true on the Republican side and on the Democratic side. They're concerned about the tariffs generally. They're concerned about the impact on consumers. They're concerned about what looks like a sort of runaway president who has taken this authority that he has been given and really pushed it to its potential limits. So you see now a number of bills in Congress to try to take back that authority, and you've seen a little bit of progress on some of those bills in the Senate, but not so much in the House, which of course is going to be the trickier body of the two, at least for now. Maybe in another 15 months that will change. But so bottom line, I think, on Congress is that they should be a player here that's part of that conversation on deals, whether and that should control the degree of innovation that's possible within them, but whether they will actually exercise that authority remains to be seen. And the question came up on how long will it take? Again, Lauren mentioned this a moment ago in the hearing earlier this week, where the USTR appeared before Congress, one of the two hearings, and a member of Congress said, how long did it take to negotiate USMCA? How long did it take to negotiate the so-called phase one deal with China? These things took a very long time, and now you all are doing this for 90 different countries at one time, and how can you, this is too much. I mean, USTR has 200 people. How could you possibly do this? Even if you add the Treasury Department and Commerce Department to that staffing, it's really hard. Okay, so that's one thing. And the second thing that's, I think, worth mentioning here, BC, is also the courts, because, and this is where, to John's earlier point about how businesses are responding, a lot of importers in the U.S. obviously are concerned, and we're now starting to see some cases being filed. We've seen 3 cases filed in the courts on the last 2 months ago tariffs on the China, Canada, and Mexico tariffs related to fentanyl, and we've not yet seen a case filed on the global baseline tariffs, but one can expect that might be coming soon. So there will be a place for the courts in this discussion. Again, I'm not certain that the courts will be exercising such an oversight role as some people might hope. The story is very similar to the Congress. The courts have the power to do this. They are in a position to evaluate what the president is doing on these measures. But again, historically, we have not seen a great deal of intervention from the courts to stop this type of thing. They tend to be highly deferential in all the litigation coming out of the first Trump administration. The courts have been deferential to, at least the appellate courts have been deferential to the president's actions in many respects. So yeah, when it comes to either Congress or the courts, BC, I think the story is the temperature is sort of lukewarm. There's, I think, some agitation, but I'm not sure enough to stop these actions from continuing as they have been.
Thank you very much, Kathleen, for those reflections. You know, I think we will continue to be in search of this way forward, or ways forward, even as we move these conversations along. We have a number of questions now, and I'm sure you've all sort of been able to see them. I will try to reorder the questions and not ask them necessarily in the way they've come in. So I'll start with the first one, which I think came in from Elisa. She had that in the comment section, but I'll read it, and then we can have the response to that. Anyone can chime in on these. We have some time. But she indicated that, as rightly pointed out, we're no longer in 1995, and the geopolitical economic landscape deeply changed. Therefore, the tariffs enshrined in the GATT schedules in 1995 do not mirror the economic situations and needs to be revised. Excuse me. What are the chances of a successful use of GATT Article 23, nullification and impairment? Do you know whether any WTO member has already declared its plans to activate it, asking the US to enter into consultations? I don't want to jump into that, but I think we've sort of taken that in part. But I'll let anyone who wants to just say a word or two quickly on that have the floor.
Can I just quickly say something, because I'm also going to have to go. So I might just quickly give my thoughts on it. I think it's 28 actually that we need to talk about, which is renegotiations. And to my knowledge, no. I mean, Gabrielle has the inside track here, so I don't know exactly, but I haven't seen anything like that. But it's a very interesting question, and also it is the GATT authorized mechanism, right? But at the end of the day, we get there by other means. I mean, even with dispute settlement, we get there by other means. It always leads to the same result, which is rebalancing of concessions, no matter whether it's by negotiation, by rebalancing in the safeguards context, by dispute settlement, retaliation. There's always rebalancing there at the end of the day. This would be the proper way of doing it. But I think, I mean, we even see this with China, right? Although it's done by percentage terms, tariff percentage terms rather than lost market access, but the concept is still there. So I think probably we're not talking there. I'm not really talking anywhere, right, yet. But of course, you're quite right. That would be where to talk officially if the US wanted to play the game properly. But that's it. I've got to go. Thank you very much for the invitation, the opportunity, and it's been very enjoyable. I'll see you all later.
Thanks, Laurent. See you later.
Bye.
Does anyone want to chime in on that again? I can move to the next question in the interest of time.
I can say a word just to confirm. When people ask me bluntly, is it possible for a WTO member to change its tariff, import tariff? The answer is yes. But there are rules, mechanism, and importantly, you often need to compensate. It's also true that a country like US or Canada have now very, very, very low tariff, while other emerging economies have quite high on average. So there is some imbalance. And yes, there's a mechanism. But my last point on tariff, because I worked for years and years in many dispute and non-dispute on the world banana issue. Because as you know, in the EU, for historical reasons, helping their old colony France, bananas from ACP would come at 0, while similar banana from Latino would come at up to, I think, possibly 700. And then informal negotiations led to a deal. But even the deal isn't perfect, because the answer was banana from Latino countries will now go into the EU at 75%, while ACP would still go at 0, and this was accepted. So my point about second best, and the question talks about plurilateral not working. My point is a more pragmatic one, is that a second or third best solution that avoid or reduces the trade war or the real war are good. And we should aim at that in terms of steps and look at things more in a transition basis and the urgency of talking. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Gabrielle. And I think that sort of takes care of Sahili's question as well. So we'll note that as answered. I'll go to Ton's question. They have indicated, do we need a new old-fashioned WTO get round to address tariffs in a broad multilateral sense? I mean, it's sort of the same question now, similar to the first one, right? In the light of the idea of balance concessions. I'll move on from that. I'll sort of let you come to it if once we have the next question. Ramesh says how to protect your country from constant trade deficit. I think we're still in free trade. Not too sure how that sits very well, but again, I think I'll come to what Errol Mendes puts there. It's more of a comment, but I think it invites some kind of engagement, however limited. He has noted, is there an underlying possibly fatal threat to the global economic and trading system regime put in after the World War II, namely with the rise of the authoritarian-led major powers? The principles of WTO, such as the most favored nation principle that was designed to protect the less powerful nations, is now being replaced by might makes right, which is really behind the misuse of national security by the US and other authoritarian powers. Innovation and deals may well cement those and then good help to poorest nations. There's a need for Canadian leadership to still promote the original ideas behind the post-World War II framework, not deals or innovations that may only help the strongest. So I think we acknowledge that this panel is deliberately designed when we put it together not to have the Global South conversations, because then even at the time, we didn't know we were already going to have the second round of tariffs that had hit Lesotho and other countries on the continent. But I think this comes to Kathleen a little bit in your suggestion of room for innovation in this era. So I'll let you have a go at that.
I would just say it's remarkable how much convergence there is among the questions. It's just that almost every question that has come in is about the future or potential of the WTO in this story, and not surprisingly, that's the area in which we focus. But I think it maybe goes without saying, but I'm going to say it given the convergence of the questions, that in the last 10 years, that has obviously not been where the conversation is here in this city where I sit. And I don't expect that to change. So if we're talking about the potential role of the WTO, I agree with everything Gabrielle said, that it's yes, we should keep talking. Is this a fatal threat? Time will tell in terms of what are we a fatal threat to what what aspect of it is it the actual structure of this particular body as we know it, or is it a fatal threat to any sort of multilateral progress? Again, I come back to the point about non-tariff barriers we've addressed several times, and how there's potential for collaboration there. Maybe the last thing, well, two more points. One is that we the United States have not left yet, and I say yet because I never know, and I don't want to be the one who predicts. But we've appointed an ambassador who, once he gets there, is someone who brings a great deal of trade experience, and that suggests to me a continued interest in participating. Yes, there's the issue with the funding. Yes, all of our international organizations memberships are under review, so anything could happen. But I again try to be optimistic about our continued participation. You've seen in recent weeks, responses to requests for consultations that, yes, they invoke the security exception, but they use the language, they're responding, they're not just sitting out. So again, from a US perspective, although I don't think that the feeling is that the answers are in the WTO, our participation, knock wood for now, continues there, and we'll take that as a positive sign. Now, the second and last thing I'll say, again, thinking about all these questions as a whole, is to use a phrase from a friend that I think the moment we are in right now is very much sort of testing the disruption budget. That is that, everyone, whether it's business, whether it's government, you have a sort of degree of disruption that you can withstand, a degree of disruption that to your normal order and way of operating that you're willing to tolerate to achieve a new end. And I thought that, as I said, a colleague put it that way, that we may be really maximizing out that disruption budget, but it does have a limit. And so it's worth sort of thinking about what happens when we hit that limit. What will that then look like? So I take all the cautionary tales from the Q&A. I think it's wise to be cautious about that. I also take the optimism from the Q&A, where people are thinking, okay, how can we utilize the WTO and in a positive direction? And I think it really will come down to that balance of disruption versus our ability to capitalize on energy for innovation that we've talked about already so much in the last hour.
I would just add very quickly, what Kathleen and Gabrielle have been saying about innovation really strongly resonates. We have not seen international tensions and geopolitical crises like we do today for a generation. And a lot has been written about history cycling in generations, but it feels very much like we are in a period of crisis now that is akin to what we were facing between World War II, before World War II, so in between World War I and World War II. And coincidentally, at that time, the US imposed 20% Smoot-Hawley tariffs. And here we are again today, similar tariff policy, this rise of nationalism. And I don't want to go too far afield here, but what came out of that crisis was Bretton Woods, GATT, the IMF, the World Bank, the institutions that really determined the framework of international trade for decades to follow. We're at another crisis period now where it will be, it feels like these institutions are going to be replaced or revised or innovated in a way where we're going to have a rethinking of these trading relationships. And it'll be interesting to see whether we retain some of the old style GATT, WTO institutions, or whether we're going to be looking at something completely new to deal exactly with this issue that Errol and others are raising.
I'd like to add three points on what was just said. I fully agree with what John just said. That was, maybe I didn't develop, but my idea of the importance and power of history. The institutions like WTO were created after world crisis of the type. I mean, we're still not at full war, but it's still a trade war. But when I talk about WTO, I'm not talking about the WTO rules. I'm talking about WTO as a forum, a place where people sit and talk. And if it's true that Americans don't trust the WTO and would, in their discussion, mix, I think, the forum and the rules, most countries, if not all of them on the planet, would say, we still need this forum, the WTO. My point was, we need this place where their mechanism of notification, transparency, call for discussions, although the rules must take into account the reason for the crisis, the why the US is acting like this. Maybe there are things for which about which they complain that are right. So, and this is my second point about non-tariff barriers. Where do you want to talk about non-tariff barriers? maybe in some regulatory forum, standardizing bodies, but non-tariff barrier was at the basis of introducing trade in agriculture into the WTO, where tariffication was used to transform all these import restrictions that were challenged by strong exporting country. So this sort of mechanism can be explored. And when I talked about mini deals, I had in mind all the world of mutual recognition, because it is an issue, because countries do things differently, whether it's in climate using tax or regulation, whether it's in digital. So all this is part of the tension that I believe US is sort of invoking. There are many things to look at, but equivalence, mutual recognitions are approaches that are less demanding, that can take place between two countries. They work, they expand, but where do you talk about them? Of course, bilaterally and regionally and eventually multilaterally. But could the world, that's another question we get all the time, could WTO work without the US? Well, every country would like to not think about it. But of course, there is no hesitation that the US is a bit alone in contesting everything, but I'm not sure they're contesting everything, because I know the US is not paying for any organization, including the WTO at the moment. But last year there was an agreement to increase the budget of the WTO slightly. So the trust is down, but the need for a forum is still there. Maybe it could move somewhere else, but there's a need for basic rules that will bring countries together and help them try to find ad hoc solution until we can multilateralize them further, in my view. Thank you.
Thank you very much for those words, Gabrielle. So I think, I'm looking at the time, we have time for one last question and a closing remark. So I'll go to Bettina's question. I think it's an interesting one. And maybe John will start us off, since it's pointed, and maybe by the time you finish that question, John, you can just offer your own closing remarks, so that we go around to Gabrielle and then to Kathleen to close this webinar. So thank you to the attendees for bearing with us. We're almost there. Following John, I'm working as trade economist, Bettina says, at the Security and Foreign Policy Institute. And what strikes me very much is a good frame for thinking about, and as well for ruling new geoeconomics in trade. So exactly, not only in terms of the national security clause, but more broadly, the use and misuse of trade arguments for addressing something else, in bracket, not pressure, incentives on NATO contributions, migration, on bracket. How would you see a good analytical frame to analyze this? And what are relevant ruling frames? Question. Economists often stress the 10 Virgin rules, saying pursue one aim by one mean, but it's really mixed. In reality, it's mixed. So it's the German Institute of Foreign and Security Affairs. I think that's where they work. They forgot to mention it there. So John, over to you.
This may be more one for the scholars than myself to answer. But let me say this, and I alluded to this earlier. Much of the work we did in the 90s, and we wrote a lot about this as well, focused on what we saw was the emerging abuse of the national security exception under trade agreements, and particularly GATT, the old GATT, as well as the GATT 1994 under the WTO framework. And I remember looking at cases. I think Portugal tried to justify a quota regime for its shoes under the national security exemption. I remember there were cases from Nicaragua and other countries. And very frequently, the GATT panels, first of all, there weren't a lot of the cases, but when they actually got to a GATT panel, sometimes the GATT panel wasn't adopted. But other times it might have been, there would have been blocking of that GATT panel. Again, this is pre-WTO, where blocking was allowed and occurred. But there did kind of emerge a body, I think, of law, and the scholars will correct me on a lot of this, but there emerged a body of law where I think the national security exception was not wholly self-judging. There was a self-judging element to it, but there was also a rationality, an objective rationality to using that national security exception. And for us, it came to a head, as I mentioned earlier, with Helms-Burton in the mid-1990s, where I guess it would have been the Clinton administration at the time said they were prepared to rely on the national security exemption under GATT 1994 to justify the Helms-Burton measure. The EU challenged it. They launched a challenge, and it was a negotiated settlement. And the parties came to a settlement in part because fear that had a panel reviewed this, there was the risk that the panel said that this could fit within the national security exception within the framework, and there'd be a fear that it would be, blown wide open from that point forward. And so there has been, it feels like a gentle hands-off approach to it until now. So it has been blown wide open now, not because of any panel decision or any decision under any other trade agreement like NAFTA, but because of a U.S. administration that's decided to blow it open, and frankly, countries like Canada that are following in its footsteps by justifying what are truly economic protectionist measures under some kind of notion of national security that includes economic security and completely disregards what these trade agreements say. So, I don't think I'm best positioned to suggest what framework should replace that. Obviously, I think we do need a broader framework. Right now in this environment, it doesn't seem like we're going to see anything like that anytime soon, unfortunately.
Thank you very much, John, for those reflections. Do you want to comment, Kathleen? We have 9 minutes here, so I leave it to your discretion, both you and Kathleen and Gabrielle, whether you just want to give your closing remarks and so that in the interest of time, we finish on time, or you have 1 word or 2 or a minute at most on the question so that we can finish on time.
Kathleen, do you want to end? So you'll do that beautifully. Or you want to speak
Gabrielle,
now?
I only have a couple of things to close with. Go ahead.
So I would only say, and I don't want to repeat, that things evolve. A few years back, for instance, agriculture was not covered. It was important. It is now. A few years back, environment or sanitary actions were seen as only protectionist. And now it's accepted. Even the WTO rules were changed so that you can have sanitary measures that are considered not protectionist. What is protectionist and what is not simple. That's why I believe we need to discuss, and we need to be open to revising things. What is unfortunate at the moment, because this issue, I worked for 30 years of the WTO, is not new. The fact that the rules do not correspond to the trade needs and reality of many countries is not new. It's just that now it's really stormy, politically and otherwise. But I think as academic, it's our role to push forward ideas and to respond to those problems. And my last point, for instance, John talked a lot about security, and I mentioned the new EU Department on Economic Security. There was this dispute report also said that a situation where 2 countries still trade a little bit together cannot give rise to security exception, which to me is, let's say, bizarre. Because the fact that you continue to trade as you want to avoid the war, therefore you may be very well in a situation of security. So I'm grateful to all those who sit and think about what is today in the digital world and everything, security, economic security and all that. And I'm grateful that I was invited to participate in this discussion. Thank you very much.
I think Gabrielle said it beautifully on evolution, and I would only add one piece to that, which is something John said a while back about rules of origin, and that being a particular area of emphasis in this evolution at this time, and one that I don't think we're talking enough about, but one that in the United States I think is very much being rethought. And reconceptualized to be much more focused on the entities that are at the heart of the product when we're talking about goods, of course, here, rather than the countries through which something came. Where we are in a firm-centric trade policy mode rather than a country-centric one, and that is going to have considerable effects throughout the trade law regime. And the last thing I would add is this is a conversation about international economic law beyond trade. And so although obviously the focus naturally and understandably so has been on trade institutions and tariffs and so forth, I do think that what we're seeing here is going to have a transformational effect on other areas of the field. And we don't have time today to get into that, but I think it's a point perhaps of what we end on, BC, is that we will see a considerable number of claims in commercial arbitration, for example, international commercial arbitration, potentially rethinking of international investment law. We already are in some respects. The ripple effect of economic security ideas throughout these other areas, let alone, we haven't said finance or monetary law, and the list goes on. So what we've touched upon today, I think, is just the tip of the iceberg. It's the most important part of the iceberg right now for most of us, but we shouldn't be thinking that this is the whole story. Obviously, there's a lot more happening below the surface of the water.
Thank you very much, Kathleen. So just in 1 minute, I'll say, on behalf of the Canadian Yearbook of International Law, we want to thank you all, Laurent, John, Kathleen, Gabrielle, for joining us, and most importantly, for all our attendees for sticking with us, and to Cambridge University Press for facilitating all of these. We hope you'll join us in future iterations of these events, and thank you so much for me.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you,
Bye.
everyone, for joining today. We'll be sharing the recording of this conversation within the next week. Full archives of the Canadian Yearbook can be found on the journal's website, which is cambridge.org/CYIL. Thanks again to the panelists and to the audience for your time. Have a great rest of the day.